The delicate gold-trimmed envelope sat on the table, untouched, its presence heavier than anything else in the room. She had received it earlier that morning, slipped into her mailbox without warning, and now it taunted her with its cruel irony. The name on the sender's label was unmistakable. Her hands trembled as she picked it up again, staring at the elegant calligraphy spelling out a name she had once whispered with love, her ex-husband. He was getting married. To someone else. A bitter smile curled on her lips. How poetic. Years ago, he had walked away from her, leaving her in the ruins of a marriage he had once sworn would last forever. His reason? She couldn't have children. It was as if all their years together, all the laughter, the struggles, the quiet moments of love meant nothing the moment he found out she was infertile. His disappointment had turned into resentment, his words had grown sharp, and the love that once bound them had shattered. And now, here he was, moving forward, inviting her, of all people, to witness his new beginning. She let out a breath and leaned back against the couch, her eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, life moved on, indifferent to the storm raging inside her. She remembered the day he had walked out. It hadn't been dramatic, no screaming, no thrown objects, just a quiet, suffocating finality. "I want a family," he had said, his voice devoid of the love it once held for her. "And I can't have that with you." Those words had felt like a blade to her chest. As if she had chosen this fate. As if she had failed him. As if love alone was not enough. 4 months after, she had drowned in the weight of his absence, questioning her worth, replaying every moment, wondering if there had been something she could have done differently. But time had its own way of revealing the truth. Slowly, she had pieced herself back together, learned to embrace the things that made her whole, beyond the expectations of a man who had defined her value by her ability to bear children. And now, karma had decided to intervene. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that fate had taken an unexpected turn. Life had a way of twisting stories in the most unimaginable ways, and his own would soon take a direction he never anticipated. He thought he had escaped, thought he had found the perfect solution to his problem. But the universe wasn't done writing this chapter yet. She exhaled sharply, looking back down at the invitation. Did he expect her to come? To sit among a crowd of well-dressed guests and watch him exchange vows with another woman? To pretend that the past hadn't happened? Or was this some twisted attempt at proving to her that he had won? That he had found happiness after her? A part of her wanted to laugh at the irony, but another part of her, the part that had once loved him so deeply, felt nothing but quiet resolve. He had made his choice. And soon, he would come to understand the full weight of it. Life had a way of coming full circle, and what he had once discarded would become the very thing he longed for the most. What he didn't know was that the woman he was marrying had a secret of her own. One that would change everything. And when the truth finally came out, he would come to realize that he had thrown away the one person who had truly loved him. But by then, it would be too late. The beginning had been beautiful. If she allowed herself to look back, to strip away the pain and betrayal, she could still remember what it felt like to be loved by him. Back then, he had been everything, her partner, her best friend, her safe place in a chaotic world. They had built a life together, weaving dreams and promises, believing they would last forever. But forever, she had learned, was a fragile thing. It was not held together by love alone. In the early years of their marriage, they had been happy. Their home had been filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and whispered confessions. She could still remember the way he used to look at her, like she was the only thing that mattered. They had spoken about the future, about children, about the kind of parents they wanted to be. They had chosen names, imagined tiny feet running across their floors, pictured bedtime stories, and birthdays filled with laughter. But when the months turned into years, and those dreams remained just that, dreams, things began to change. At first, it was subtle. The way he would hesitate before answering when people asked when they were planning to have kids. The way his excitement dulled each time another test came back negative. But then, it became something else entirely. Resentment. The doctor's words had been clinical, delivered with the kind of detachment that medical professionals were trained to have. "I'm sorry," the specialist had said, her hands folded neatly over the papers that held the verdict. "It's unlikely that you'll be able to conceive naturally." Her world had stopped in that moment. She had looked at him, searching for reassurance, for comfort, for any sign that they were in this together. But instead, she had seen something else in his eyes, something cold, something distant. A shift had taken place, one that neither of them spoke about but both of them felt. At first, she tried to hold on. She suggested adoption, surrogacy, anything that would keep them from falling apart. But the problem wasn't that they couldn't have children, the problem was that he saw her as broken. A flaw in his otherwise perfect plan. The man who had once promised to love her unconditionally began to pull away. He stopped reaching for her hand, stopped looking at her the way he used to. The warmth in their home turned into something else, an unbearable silence, a void she couldn't fill, no matter how hard she tried. He stopped saying "I love you" as often, then stopped saying it altogether. He worked later. He barely spoke during dinner. And worst of all, he had stopped trying to hide the disappointment in his eyes whenever he looked at her. She could feel him slipping away, and no matter what she did, she couldn't hold on to him. He no longer saw her as his wife, his partner, his equal. She was a roadblock, an obstacle standing in the way of the life he believed he deserved. And then, one evening, he had finally said the words she had been dreading. "I don't think this is working anymore." It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a conversation filled with emotion or regret. It was a decision he had already made long before he spoke it out loud. She had sat there, frozen, waiting for an explanation, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would make it make sense. But all he did was stare at the table, refusing to meet her gaze. "I want a family," he had continued, as if she hadn't spent years wanting the exact same thing. As if she hadn't been the one who had cried herself to sleep after every failed attempt. As if she hadn't already lost enough. The final blow came when he packed his bags, not in anger, not in haste, but in quiet determination. Like leaving her was simply another task to be completed. Like she was something to be discarded. She never begged. She never cried in front of him. If he had already decided to leave, then there was nothing left to fight for. And just like that, the man who had once promised to love her forever walked out of their home and never looked back. The divorce had been swift. He had been eager to start over, eager to erase the life they had built together. Within months, she had watched from a distance as he re-entered the dating world, searching for someone who could give him the one thing she couldn't. She had expected to feel bitter, expected to be consumed by the kind of heartbreak that left people hollow. And for a while, she had been. But then, something unexpected happened. She began to heal. Slowly, she stopped seeing herself through his eyes. She was not broken. She was not unworthy. She was not defined by what she could or couldn't give him. And now, as she stared at the wedding invitation he had sent her, she felt something else entirely. Not sadness. Not anger. Just a quiet certainty. One day, he would understand. One day, he would regret the choices he had made. And when that day came, she wouldn't be there to pick up the pieces. For the first few months after the divorce, she felt like she was moving through a fog, like she was awake, but not really living. Everything reminded her of what she had lost, of what had been taken from her. The empty side of the bed. The quietness of the house. The absence of his voice, his presence, his scent lingering in the air. She had built a life around him, around their dreams, and now that he was gone, it was as if she had been left with nothing but a hollow shell of what once was. She spent nights replaying the past, wondering if there had been something she could have done differently. Had she loved him enough? Had she fought hard enough? Had she failed him, not just in the way he had claimed, but in ways she never realized? The questions were relentless, eating away at her in the silence of the night. But time, as cruel and unforgiving as it was, had a way of forcing people to move forward, whether they were ready or not. She forced herself to get up every morning. Forced herself to go to work, to smile when people asked how she was doing, to pretend that she was fine. At first, it was just that, pretending. But slowly, without realizing it, the act became real. She wasn't fine, not yet, but she was surviving. And that was enough. One day, she woke up and realized that the pain wasn't as sharp as it had once been. It was still there, a dull ache rather than a piercing wound, but it no longer consumed her. She started rediscovering herself, the parts of her that had been lost in the shadows of her marriage. She threw herself into her work, taking on projects she had once hesitated to accept. She started spending more time with friends, allowing laughter to creep back into her life. She picked up old hobbies, painting, reading, traveling to places she had always wanted to see but never did because he hadn't been interested. It was during one of those trips, a spontaneous weekend getaway to a coastal town, that she had a realization so simple yet so profound it almost took her breath away. She was happy. Not in the way she used to be, not in the way she had once imagined happiness, but in a way that was entirely her own. For the first time in years, she was living for herself. She no longer measured her worth by her ability to be a wife, by her ability to bear children. She was more than that. She was a woman with dreams, with passions, with a life that extended beyond the expectations of others. And for the first time, she saw herself not as someone who had been left behind, but as someone who had been given a second chance. Meanwhile, life continued for her ex-husband. She heard bits and pieces of it through mutual friends, through social media posts she tried to avoid but sometimes stumbled upon. He was engaged. The woman was beautiful, younger, and, by all appearances, everything he had been looking for. He had moved on quickly, too quickly, some whispered, but she no longer felt the sting of it. She had once believed that love was permanent, that when two people built a life together, it was meant to last. But now, she understood that love, at least the kind he had given her, was conditional. He had loved her only when it was easy, only when she fit into the mold of what he had wanted. But true love wasn't something that could be discarded so easily. And so, she let him go, truly and completely, for the first time. Months passed, then a year, and with it came even more growth. She had a new apartment now, smaller than the house they had shared but filled with warmth, with things that were hers alone. She had a new sense of confidence, a new appreciation for the person she was becoming. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. She was at a bookstore, browsing through a section she rarely visited, when someone caught her attention. He was standing a few feet away, flipping through a book with a quiet intensity, unaware that he was being watched. She didn't know why she kept looking, why something about him felt familiar, even though they had never met. He looked up, their eyes met, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something stir inside her. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. Curiosity. A spark of possibility. He smiled, and she found herself smiling back. She didn't know what would come of it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what the future held. She had learned that life had its own way of working things out, of closing one door and opening another in the most unexpected ways. And somewhere, far away, her ex-husband was about to learn that very same lesson, only his would come with a much crueler twist. He had thought he won. He had convinced himself that leaving was the right decision, that he had done what any man in his position would have done. He wanted a family, children, a legacy. And she, his first wife, could never give him that. So he had left, walked away without looking back, and moved on to someone who could. At least, that was what he had believed. His new wife was everything he had imagined in a perfect partner, young, vibrant, and eager to start a family. They had met not long after his divorce, their connection easy, effortless. Unlike his first wife, she never carried the weight of past disappointments. She was full of life, full of promise, and most importantly, she could give him what he had always wanted. Or so he thought. The wedding had been a grand affair. Friends and family had celebrated his new beginning, offering congratulations and warm wishes. He had stood at the altar, looking at the woman in front of him, convinced that this time, things would be different. There would be no heartbreak, no unfulfilled expectations. This time, he was sure he had made the right choice. And for a while, life seemed perfect. The honeymoon was filled with laughter, with whispered promises of the future they would build together. They spoke about the children they would have, about the names they had always dreamed of, about the life that awaited them. He felt a sense of relief, a certainty that he had finally set his life on the right course. But then, as months passed, the excitement faded into routine, and the topic of starting a family became more than just talk. At first, he didn't think much of it. He was patient. These things took time. But as months stretched into a year with no pregnancy, that familiar seed of unease began to take root. He had been here before. He had watched time slip away, watched hope turn into doubt, watched love sour under the weight of unspoken fears. But this time, he told himself, things would be different. His new wife was young. There was no reason for concern. They would try again. And so, they did. Another year passed. Still nothing. He began to feel the frustration clawing at him, the same way it had in his previous marriage. The disappointment he had once placed solely on his first wife now hung in the air again, but this time, he didn't know who to blame. Then, one day, he found her crying. She was in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she held something in her lap. It was a medical report. He didn't need to ask what it was. His heart pounded as he reached for it, but before he could read a single word, she spoke. "I should have told you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. He felt the world tilt beneath him. His grip on the paper tightened. "Told me what?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt, with regret, with something he couldn't yet understand. "I can't have children," she said, and the words hit him like a train. His mind struggled to process it. "What?" he breathed, the room suddenly suffocating. She swallowed hard, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress as if bracing for impact. "I found out years ago, before we met. I thought," she let out a shaky breath. "I thought maybe it wouldn't matter. I thought love would be enough." His body went rigid, his chest tightening as realization slammed into him. She knew. She had always known. Unlike his first wife, she hadn't been blindsided by fate, hadn't discovered the truth after years of heartbreak. No, she had walked into this marriage with full knowledge of the one thing he had left his first wife for. And she had chosen not to tell him. Anger surged through him, hot and unforgiving. "You lied to me," he whispered, his voice shaking. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she shook her head. "I didn't mean to. I was afraid you wouldn't want me." He let out a sharp, bitter laugh, the sound foreign even to his own ears. "You're right," he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I wouldn't have." The moment they left his lips, he knew he had shattered something beyond repair. The pain in her eyes was unmistakable, but in that moment, he didn't care. All he could think about was the cruel twist of fate. He had left his first wife for something she couldn't control. He had broken her heart, walked away without a second thought, believing that he deserved more. And now, he had ended up in the exact same place. No, worse. Because this time it hadn't been fate. This time it had been a lie. He turned away from her, his hands shaking, his mind racing. He needed to breathe. He needed to think. But no matter how many breaths he took, no matter how much he tried to clear his mind, one thought refused to leave him. His first wife. The woman he had abandoned. The woman he had blamed. The woman he had convinced himself was the problem, when in reality, she had been the only one who had ever truly loved him. And now, she was gone. Gone from his life. Gone from his reach. And there was no way to fix it. She hadn't thought about him in a long time. Not in the way she used to, with pain lingering behind every memory, with questions she would never get answers to. He had become a shadow in her past, a chapter she had closed with quiet finality. The woman she was now was not the woman he had left behind. She no longer measured herself by his absence, no longer carried the weight of his rejection. She had rebuilt her life, not as a means to prove him wrong, but because she had discovered, truly discovered, who she was beyond him. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, life took a turn she never saw coming. It had started with a simple encounter. She had been out running errands, lost in the mundanity of an ordinary day, when she crossed paths with someone unexpected. He was a stranger at first, until he wasn't. It was the man from the bookstore. The one whose eyes had lingered on her just a little too long, the one who had smiled in a way that made her pause. She had thought nothing of it at the time, dismissing it as nothing more than a fleeting moment, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. Their second meeting had not been accidental. He had approached her, hesitant yet certain, as if drawn to something he couldn't quite explain. There was something familiar in his presence, something steady, something safe. They talked. Then, they talked again. One conversation turned into two into late-night calls into something neither of them had been expecting. She had been hesitant at first, cautious of allowing someone new into the life she had so carefully rebuilt. But he was different. He was patient. He never made her feel like she needed to be anything other than who she was. He didn't see her as incomplete, didn't look at her with silent disappointment. With him, she was whole. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was an ordinary evening, the two of them sitting across from each other in a quiet cafe, their hands resting on the table between them. They had been talking about nothing in particular, laughing about something ridiculous, when he suddenly hesitated. She noticed it instantly. "What is it?" she asked, tilting her head. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck before meeting her gaze. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with something unspoken. She felt her heart rate pick up, but she nodded, urging him to continue. He took a deep breath. "I have a son." The words hung between them, a quiet revelation that shifted everything and yet, nothing at all. For a moment, she simply stared at him, processing. Not because it was something she had never considered, she knew he had lived a life before her, just as she had lived one before him, but because of what it meant. And then, just as quickly, she realized that it didn't change a thing. She smiled. "Tell me about him." The relief in his eyes was instant. And as he spoke, about the boy who had changed his world, about the laughter and chaos and love that filled his home, she felt something unexpected. Not envy. Not sadness. Just warmth. She had spent so long believing that motherhood was a door forever closed to her. That love, family, all of it was something she could only watch from a distance. But here he was, offering her something she had never thought possible, not in the way she had once imagined, but in a way that felt even more right. A family. Not built from biology, not defined by what she could or couldn't give, but something real nonetheless. And in that moment, she knew. She had spent years grieving the loss of something that was never meant to be. But now, she understood. Life didn't take away without reason. Sometimes, it simply had a different plan. And somewhere, far away, in a life that no longer belonged to her, her ex-husband was facing a truth of his own. The family he had destroyed in search of something better had never existed to begin with. And while she was stepping into something new, something beautiful, he was watching the world he had built crumble beneath him. Fate, she realized, always found a way to balance the scales. The silence in his house was deafening. Once, it had been filled with laughter, with the sound of promises spoken between lovers, with the hopeful whispers of a future he had so desperately wanted. But now, it was empty, just like the life he had built. She was gone. His second wife had packed her things in quiet anger, her movements sharp with betrayal, with exhaustion, with the weight of unspoken words. She hadn't fought. She hadn't screamed. She had simply looked at him with hollow eyes and told him she was done. And now, he was alone. Again. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had left his first wife because he wanted more, wanted a family, wanted a legacy. He had convinced himself that love wasn't enough, that he deserved a future filled with children and laughter and everything he had been denied. He had justified walking away, told himself that he had done what any man in his position would have done. But karma had a way of humbling even the most arrogant of men. His second wife had deceived him. She had known all along that she couldn't give him what he wanted, yet she had chosen to marry him anyway, allowing him to believe in a future that would never come. And now, after all his sacrifices, all his choices, all the pain he had inflicted, he had ended up exactly where he had started, only this time, there was no one left to blame but himself. The weight of it settled into his bones, pressing down on him like an unbearable force. He thought about his first wife more than he cared to admit. At first, it had been nothing more than fleeting thoughts, passing moments of nostalgia, of wondering what she was doing, of whether she had moved on. He had assumed she was still alone, still grieving the life they had lost. But then he had seen her. It had been by accident, a chance encounter in a crowded street. She hadn't seen him, hadn't noticed the way his breath had caught in his throat when he laid eyes on her. She looked different. Not different in the way time changes people, but in a way that unsettled him. She looked lighter, as if she had finally let go of the burdens he had placed on her. She moved with ease, with confidence, with a happiness that had nothing to do with him. And worst of all, she wasn't alone. The man beside her was unfamiliar, yet it was clear that he wasn't just a passing acquaintance. There was something intimate in the way they stood together, something unspoken in the way she smiled at him. A smile he hadn't seen in years. That was the moment it truly hit him. She had moved on. She had found happiness, love, a future, without him. And he? He had thrown everything away for a dream that had never been real. Regret was an ugly thing. It crept into his thoughts at night, whispering reminders of the choices he had made, of the love he had taken for granted. He found himself replaying memories, moments he had once dismissed as insignificant. The way she had looked at him when they were first married, full of trust and devotion. The way she had held on to hope, even as their struggles mounted. The way she had tried to hold them together, even when he had already decided to let go. He had thought she would always be there, lingering in the background of his life, a reminder of what once was. But now, he realized the truth. She wasn't waiting for him. She never had been. And now, it was too late. His second marriage had failed. The life he had built had collapsed. And the one person who had ever truly loved him was now out of reach. The worst part? She wasn't bitter. She wasn't angry. She was simply gone. And for the first time, he understood what true loss felt like. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. He had spent months trying to push her from his mind, but the harder he tried, the more she found ways to haunt him. Not in a deliberate way, not because she wanted to, but because she had become a symbol of everything he had lost. He told himself that he had made peace with it, that life had simply taken them in different directions. And yet, when he saw her again, standing just a few feet away, all those carefully constructed lies collapsed. It happened on a day that should have been unremarkable. A quick stop at a cafe, a break in his routine that he hadn't planned. He had barely looked around when he stepped inside, too caught up in his own thoughts, too tired from yet another sleepless night spent questioning the choices that had led him here. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, he saw her. She was standing at the counter, laughing softly at something the man beside her had said. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound he had once taken for granted. It was the kind of laugh that made people turn, that held warmth, that hinted at a life filled with joy. For a moment, he just stared, unable to move, unable to breathe. She looked different, not because she had changed physically, but because of the way she carried herself. She was lighter somehow, brighter. The woman he had once known had been weighed down by heartache, by disappointment, by the strain of trying to be enough for a man who never truly saw her. But this woman? She was free. His chest tightened as he took in the details he hadn't noticed before. The way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the effortless way she leaned into the man beside her. The familiarity in their body language told him everything he didn't want to know. She had moved on. And she was happy. He should have walked away. He should have turned and left before she saw him, before she had a chance to confirm what he already knew, that she didn't need him anymore. But his feet were rooted to the floor, his heart hammering in his chest as if he had been caught doing something he shouldn't. And then, as if sensing his gaze, she turned. Their eyes met, and in that single moment, everything he had been running from hit him with full force. It was different from the last time they had seen each other. Then, she had been a ghost from his past, someone he had barely recognized. But now, in the warmth of this cafe, surrounded by the life she had built without him, she was more real than she had ever been. For a split second, something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe even recognition. But it was brief, gone before he could grasp it. And then she smiled. Not the kind of smile people gave when they saw an old friend, not the kind that carried warmth or nostalgia. It was polite. Distant. Like he was a stranger. And maybe, in a way, he was. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to nod in acknowledgement. It was all he could manage. She didn't stop to talk. She didn't ask him how he was, didn't offer the kind of conversation he suddenly craved. Instead, she turned back to the man beside her, her attention already shifting away. And just like that, she was gone again. He stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the empty space she had occupied just moments before. He should have been happy for her. He should have felt relieved that she had found the happiness she deserved. But all he felt was the slow, crushing weight of regret settling over him like a storm that had been waiting to break. He had made a choice once. He had left her, believing that there was something better waiting for him. But life had a way of revealing the truth in the harshest of ways. And the truth was this: the woman he had spent years convincing himself wasn't enough had become the kind of person he could only admire from a distance. She had won. Not in a way that could be measured by success or status, but in the only way that truly mattered. She had healed. She had moved on. And he? He was still standing in the past, clinging to something that no longer existed. Regret was a slow poison, one that seeped into the cracks of his life, spreading through every moment of silence, every empty space she had once occupied. He had walked away from his first marriage thinking he was freeing himself from a burden, convinced that he was chasing a life that was meant for him, a life filled with the children he had always wanted, a future untouched by disappointment. But the irony of it all had come full circle, and he was drowning in the weight of his choices. He had lost everything. His second wife was gone, taking with her the illusion of the perfect life he had once imagined. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of deception, but the truth was, it wasn't just about the lie she had told. It was about something far deeper, something he had refused to acknowledge for years. It was never about children. It had never been about infertility, about wanting a family, about needing more than what his first wife could give him. It had been about him, his own selfishness, his inability to appreciate the love he had, his desperate need to chase a version of happiness that didn't exist. And now, standing in the quiet emptiness of his home, he was forced to accept the reality he had spent so long avoiding. He had thrown away a good woman. A woman who had loved him when he had nothing, who had stood beside him when things were hard, who had given him every part of herself even when he hadn't deserved it. And instead of valuing her, instead of fighting for what they had, he had walked away without hesitation, without remorse. But karma was patient. It didn't come with anger or fury. It came quietly, in moments like this, when he sat alone at a dinner table meant for two, when he reached for his phone and realized there was no one to call, when he caught his own reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. The final blow came on a random evening, through a mutual friend who still believed he deserved to know. "She's getting married." The words landed like a punch to his stomach, knocking the breath out of him. He had known she had moved on, he had seen it with his own eyes, but hearing it, knowing that she was truly starting over, was something else entirely. She wasn't just happy. She wasn't just dating someone new. She was marrying him. And this time, it wasn't built on empty promises, on expectations she could never meet. This time, she was walking into a love that saw her for exactly who she was, a love that didn't place conditions on her worth. He should have expected it. He should have prepared himself for this moment, should have accepted long ago that she was never going to wait for him. But that was the thing about regret, it didn't care about what you thought you deserved. It only reminded you of what you had lost. For days, he wrestled with the knowledge, fighting the instinct to reach out, to say something, anything, that might undo the damage he had caused. But he knew the truth. There was nothing he could say. There was nothing left to fix. She had already forgiven him, not in the way that invited him back into her life, but in the way that truly set her free. And that, he realized, was the real difference between them. He had spent years believing that love was something that could be replaced, that it was tied to circumstances, to what someone could or couldn't give. But she had always known the truth. Love was never about conditions. It was about acceptance. About choosing someone even when things weren't perfect. About staying when it was hard, when it was uncertain, when the future wasn't clear. And now, as she stepped into her new life with someone who truly understood that, he was left standing in the ruins of his own making, forced to watch from a distance as she got everything he had once claimed to want. But this time, she wouldn't be looking back. And for the rest of his life, he would have to live with the knowledge that he had been the architect of his own loneliness. Because in the end, karma had done what it always did. It had given him exactly what he deserved.